Funerals have a strange way of making time feel heavier. The air itself seemed thicker that day, as if every breath carried the weight of things unsaid. I stood near the casket, my hands clasped tightly in front of me, trying to keep my composure. My father's face looked peaceful, almost unfamiliar in its stillness. It was the first time I'd ever seen him without the spark in his eyes. People came and went, offering condolences, placing flowers, whispering memories. I nodded, thanked them, accepted their kind words as politely as I could, though they floated past me like distant echoes. I wasn't ready for any of it. The loss, the finality, the quiet. And then I saw him. A man I had never seen before stood at the edge of the crowd. Tall, well-dressed, with silver hair and sharp eyes that didn't wander like the others. He wasn't just attending, he was watching me. At first, I assumed he was an old friend of my father's, someone from his youth, maybe a business associate. But as the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, he didn't approach anyone else. He walked straight toward me. "Stella," he said, his voice calm but carrying something weighty beneath it. "I've waited a long time to meet you." I frowned, instinctively stepping back. There was something in the way he said my name, not as a stranger might, but with the ease of someone who had practiced it. He looked at me steadily. "I know this isn't the right time, but there's something you need to know." He paused, as if gathering strength for the words that followed. "I'm your real father." The world seemed to tilt. The soft sounds of people talking, birds in the trees, the rustle of leaves, everything faded into silence. For a heartbeat, I stood there frozen, staring at him, my mind blank. It was absurd. Impossible. My father was in the casket. My real father had just been buried. And yet, the man in front of me spoke with such certainty that it made my stomach tighten. I managed a quiet, shaky, "What?" But he didn't elaborate. He simply handed me a small envelope, his name printed on the front, and said, "When you're ready." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing between the grave and a truth I hadn't asked for. I clutched the envelope tightly as if it might vanish. The world I knew had already cracked once that day, and now I felt it splinter again. 4 days after the funeral, the envelope sat on my dresser like a quiet intruder. I couldn't bring myself to open it. Every time I passed by, my eyes landed on it, my chest tightening with the weight of everything unspoken. I told myself it was probably a misunderstanding. Maybe he was a distant relative, someone confused by grief. Maybe he was lying. Anything was easier than believing that the man I had called father my entire life wasn't truly my father at all. But his voice kept replaying in my head. The way he said my name. The certainty in his tone. It hadn't been desperate or confused. Had been steady. Like someone who had waited years for one moment to finally arrive. Nights were the hardest. The house was too quiet without my father's presence. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, the shadows shifting with the passing cars, my mind circling back to the stranger at the funeral. His face. His eyes. The way he'd walked away without trying to convince me. He didn't need to. On the third night, I finally sat down at my dresser and picked up the envelope. My hands shook slightly as I slid my finger under the flap. Inside was a neatly folded letter, written in precise, deliberate handwriting. He explained that his name was Richard Hale, and that he had known my mother long before I was born. Their relationship had ended when she moved on, but she never told him she was pregnant. Years later, he found out the truth through a mutual friend, but by then, my life was already built around another man, the man I had buried just days ago. Richard wrote that he never wanted to disrupt my childhood or tear apart the family that had raised me. So he stayed away. But he watched from a distance. Quietly. He supported in ways I never knew. Small donations to my school, contributions under other names. And when my father died, he decided it was finally time for me to know the truth. The letter wasn't emotional. It wasn't begging for forgiveness. It was factual, careful, and deeply human. When I finished reading, I just sat there, staring at the paper, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to tear it up. Another part wanted to believe it. For the first time, I noticed how my reflection in the mirror didn't look quite like my father's. People had always said I had unique eyes. I never thought twice about it. Now I couldn't stop. Once the letter was read, I couldn't go back to pretending it didn't exist. It was as if Richard's words had unlocked a door in my mind that I couldn't close again. Every corner of my childhood, every memory, suddenly looked different under this new light. I started noticing things I had never questioned before. Family photographs lined the hallway of my house. Birthdays, school plays, vacations. In every single picture, my father's hand was on my shoulder, steady and proud. But as I stared at our faces side by side, small differences began to whisper their way to the surface. The curve of my nose, the unusual shade of my eyes, features no one in my family shared. I decided to go through my mother's old belongings, which had been packed away in boxes in the attic after she died. Dust clung to everything. The air smelled faintly of cedar and age. It felt like stepping into a forgotten part of my own life. I sifted through photos, letters, small keepsakes, mementos of a woman who had always kept parts of herself hidden. In one box, tucked beneath a pile of yellowed magazines, I found a bundle of envelopes tied together with a thin ribbon. Each one was addressed to my mother in handwriting that matched the letter Richard had sent me. They weren't love letters, not exactly. They were thoughtful, almost careful. Notes about her well-being, gentle words of affection, occasional mentions of places they had shared. The dates on the letters matched a time long before I was born. In another box, I found an old photograph I had never seen before. My mother, young and radiant, standing beside Richard. They looked comfortable together, not staged, not distant. He had his arm around her waist, and she was laughing at something just outside the frame. My chest tightened as I held the photo. It wasn't a stranger's face anymore. It was the same man who had stood at my father's funeral and told me he was my real father. And now, for the first time, I didn't immediately doubt him. I spent hours in that attic, surrounded by fragments of a past I had never known existed. Each discovery chipped away at the story I had grown up believing. It wasn't that my parents had lied maliciously. It felt more like they had built a quiet wall to keep the truth contained. When I finally climbed back down, clutching the photo and letters, the world outside looked the same, but I wasn't. The foundation beneath me had shifted. Richard's words were no longer just words. They were starting to become real. I waited almost a week before I called him. His number was printed neatly at the bottom of the letter, like an invitation I wasn't sure I wanted to accept. Every day I stared at it, my thumb hovering over my phone, my mind spinning with questions I wasn't ready to hear the answers to. But after finding the letters and the photograph, something inside me shifted. Doubt was no longer my shield, it was just a delay. And the truth had already started to take root. The day I finally dialed his number, my hands were cold. He answered after one ring, his voice steady and calm, as if he had been waiting for this call for years. There was no surprise, only quiet relief. We agreed to meet at a small cafe near the park. I chose the location, neutral ground, away from the house where all my memories lived. I arrived early and sat near the window, watching the world pass by while my mind played out every possible version of what was about to happen. When Richard walked in, I recognized him instantly. Not because he looked exactly like me, though in that moment I noticed small reflections of myself in him, but because of the quiet way he carried himself, the same way he had at the funeral. He didn't rush over. He paused at the door, found me with his eyes, and only then approached. We didn't speak right away. For a few seconds we just sat there, studying each other in a silence that felt strangely natural. He wasn't a stranger anymore, but he wasn't family yet either. He existed somewhere in between, a living question mark. He began telling me about the past, about my mother, about the choices that had shaped both their lives. There was no dramatic reveal, no grand gestures. His words were measured, honest, almost fragile. He told me how he'd found out about me, how he had respected her decision to keep her life separate, even though it broke him. He spoke of birthdays he spent alone, knowing mine was happening somewhere else. Of photographs he collected quietly. He listened, really listened. There were no accusations on my tongue, no rehearsed lines. Just the steady rhythm of his voice and the slow, unfamiliar comfort of his presence. When he pulled out a small, worn photo of my mother holding me as a baby, my breath caught. He had kept it all these years. A single image of the life he'd never been allowed to be part of. We parted without promises, without rushing anything. But when I walked away, the air around me felt different. Lighter. I didn't have all the answers yet. But for the first time, I wasn't running from the truth. I was walking toward it. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest truths. In the weeks that followed my meeting with Richard, the chaos inside me began to settle. The shock that had once felt like a storm slowly turned into something quieter, something I could finally sit with. I didn't rush our connection. There were no sudden declarations of fatherhood, no overnight transformations. Instead, we moved carefully, like two people approaching the edges of something fragile. We met for coffee on Sundays. We walked through the park where my mother used to take me as a child. He told me stories I had never heard, stories that didn't rewrite my past but filled in its missing spaces. With each conversation, the man I once saw as a stranger became more familiar. He remembered details about my childhood from a distance, things he had quietly observed but never interfered with. There was a gentleness in his presence, a kind of respect that made it easier to breathe around him. Meanwhile, my family began to adjust too. At first, there was confusion, hesitation, even discomfort. But when they saw that I wasn't abandoning the memory of the father who raised me, only accepting the full truth of where I came from, their resistance softened. The two versions of my life didn't have to cancel each other out. They could coexist like two different melodies blending into one. One evening, as autumn crept in, I visited the cemetery alone. The air was cool, the leaves crisp beneath my shoes. I stood before my father's grave, the man who had raised me, taught me, loved me unconditionally. For a moment, guilt pricked at me, as if accepting Richard's truth meant betraying his memory. But as the wind rustled through the trees, that feeling passed. I whispered, "Thank you," and meant it. For everything he had given me, for the life he built, for the love that shaped me. As I walked home, I realized that this story wasn't about replacing one father with another. It was about understanding myself fully. Every thread, every truth, every hidden part. Richard didn't become a savior or a new anchor in my life. He became something quieter, a piece of my story I never knew was missing. And that was enough. Sitting on my porch that night, wrapped in a soft blanket, I looked up at the stars. For the first time since that funeral, I felt calm. Not because everything was simple, but because I had stopped fighting what was real. This was my truth. And it finally felt like mine to keep.